when you're solving this, finding the equation that fits with this graph, they tell you it's a secant graph, but you have a couple choices. You can use a graph that has a positive leading coefficient or a negative, and I'm going to show you in both cases. Okay? So for each case, your general form is going to be some number out front times the secant of, and you're going to have some value inside. We'll talk about where that comes from, x minus some shift that occurs, and then plus some vertical shift happening. Okay, so this is the general form of your function. So the easiest thing to do is to first find this value. This value is your midline. So the midline is going to be halfway between here, these critical points, and you can identify any of them. I'll go ahead and just start with this near one. So if I find this point is -1 and my relative minimum is -1, my relative maximum here is -7. So between -1 and -7, my midline is halfway between that. So if I take -1 plus a -7, divide by 2, I get -8/2 or -4. So my midline is going to be right here at this -4. Okay, which means a -4 is my D value. Okay. So the next thing I need to do is find my A value. Well, again, I can choose to have it be a positive or negative value. This first time through, I'm going to choose to have it be a positive value. Okay. If I choose to have it be a positive value, that means that the corresponding cosine function is going to start at a maximum, and then it's going to have midline, minimum, midline, maximum. So these are the 5 critical points I'm going to choose when I find the equation for this graph if I use a positive A value. Now my A value is going to be the amplitude of my cosine function, which is the distance from the midline to this max and the midline to this minimum. They should be the same number. So if I count this up, I go 1, 2, 3 units up, 1, 2, 3 units down. So my A value is 3. I don't know my B value yet, and I don't know my C value yet, but I found my midline and my coefficient out front. Okay, so the next thing I can do is find my C value. My C value is my horizontal shift, my phase shift. So the way I find my phase shift is I just look at this first critical point that I chose, and I use that as my number. So that is my C value right here. So I can plug in 15 pi over 7, 15 pi over 7 for my C value. Okay, and so the last thing I need to do is find what my B value is. And the way I find my B value is I need to take my period 2 pi over B, and I can count my period by seeing how long it takes to repeat these 5 critical points. So from here to this point is 1 period. So again, from 15 pi over 7 to 17 pi over 7, so that's a total of 2 pi over 7. So there is my period based on the graph. And so I can find what my corresponding B value is by plotting or solving for B here. Well, I can see that B is equal to 7. If I wanted to solve for it, I can multiply both sides by B to get it out of the denominator. And then I can isolate B by multiplying by the reciprocal. 7 over 2 pi. 7 over 2 pi. The 2 pi's cancel and the 7 cancels, leaving B by itself. Here the 2 pi's cancel, leaving B is equal to 7. So I can replace B with 7. So the easiest answer for the equation of this graph is found this way. 3 times the secant of 7 times the quantity x minus 15 pi over 7, all minus 4. Now, if I wanted to, I could distribute this through and maybe make it a little bit simpler. So 3 times the secant of, and if I distribute my 7, I get 7x minus here the 7's cancel, 15 pi, all minus 4. And so this is probably the most common answer that you would identify based on this graph. And now I could have used different shifts, right? I could have shifted all the way over here, so I could have used 17 pi over 7 as my shift. I could have used 19 pi over 7, so any of these points right here I could have used as my phase shift, and everything else would be the same. And now I mentioned that I could also have used a negative in front of my function. So if I chose to use a -3 as my multiplier, everything else is going to stay the same except for my phase shift. So the only value that is going to change is this C value. And if I used a negative, then that means that I would have had to start at a minimum. So I could use my minimums here. Let's say I use minimum, midline, maximum, midline, minimum. So if I shifted to this point, which is 16 pi over 7, I could have used that as my function. Okay? Again, if I simplified it and distributed through, I'd get -3 secant, distribute the 7 through, 7x minus the 7's cancel, 16 pi, minus 4. So this is also an acceptable answer. Again, there are many acceptable answers. It all depends whether you want to use a positive or a negative number in front of your function.